Okay, in this presentation, I am going to briefly introduce one of the most recent theories within political science. It actually kind of comes from a combination of political science, sociology, philosophy, and then the natural sciences. It's sometimes called constructionism, it's sometimes called constructivism, sometimes it's called post-structuralism in international relations. And then if you were to look up French philosophy, sometimes it's called deconstructionism. Um, I think, let me just say two things about this before we get started. This is the theory that I use in my research and in my publications. And I also use this in the classroom. You'll see after I go through this presentation that it's the most complicated of the three theories that you're being given. And so I want you kind of always remembering two things. One is the predictability, the other one is parsimony. So for predictability purposes, this theory, in my opinion, is better than the other two theories, pluralism and elitism. But parsimony, it explains a lot, but there's still some questions because of people not accepting the theory. So this is true of a lot of theories in natural science and medicine. And so, it's tough to get at parsimony because we're talking, and remember, parsimony is being able to explain something without there being a lot of exceptions. So, I'll get into the kind of the complication of this, but I think you'll wrestle with this all semester as you build up to the final exam. Parsimony is important for a theory, but it's not the only thing that's important. So I think this one does better with predictability or applicability, right? We can predict a scenario in the future, say 2025, 2030, with some pretty good clarity. So, this is to me, the easiest way of explaining this. So remember this. Constructionist theory accepts that we are constantly making, challenging, reinforcing social arrangements, the rules, the costs and benefits. And the best example here in New York is the Bodega Cat, right? The Bodega Cat is the obvious domestication, of this process, right? From my point of view, the Bodega Cat has it pretty great. But think about it another way, right? What is the role of the Bodega Cat? Well, it keeps away rats, right? It keeps away mice. So it has a real functional job within this kind of social structure of capitalism. And so its reward is that it kind of gets to spend its time on this private property. But also think about all the people that come in and talk to the Bodega Cat. They're nice to the Bodega Cat, people who say they're allergic. There's this kind of constant rearranging based on this one role. And this is, how we want to start to think about objects scientifically. So the other picture here is the Greek legend of Prometheus, who allegedly stole fire from the gods and then shared it amongst the people, and this forever changed human beings. And this is what we want to think about when we think about social arrangements in the future, right? How we create objects of our own understanding and our social relations will largely change, right, or affect how we think about our futures and what our roles are in that process. So this is the hardest part of the theory, so I just want to kind of get into it right away. So if you're in a classroom where you are participating in creating knowledge, you're sharing your lived experience, you're having dialogue as opposed to a debate of monological positions, right? It's not just one person arguing with another person, but you're examining and really thinking deeply about the content and from a number of different point of views, then you're doing constructivism. How it applies to the theory of American government, comes from this process that two philosophers, Patricia Hill Collins, from Black feminist thought, and then Bruno Latour from science studies. It's how humans construct knowledge based on our relationships with objects. So with Patricia Hill Collins, she very accurately described the process of publications, particularly from the 1900s to the 1930s, being the products or objects of white male elites and that reflected their lived experience or their knowledge. So it wasn't universal knowledge. And her main point was that when she went to college, this knowledge from white men from the 1900s and before didn't speak to her lived experience. They obviously didn't have anything in common. And so she didn't doubt their knowledge. She assumed that they must know what they're talking about in their world, but that there should be room in academia or in higher education for other points of view and other ways of making knowledge. So knowledge is always relative, and this is kind of the point, and that it's always changing. And so there's not one thing as like absolute knowledge or absolute truth. Now, Bruno Latour took this a step further and said, not only is knowledge relative to the group that constructs it, it's also used in different ways. So for example, the knowledge that it takes to dig out the silica, the chemical element that's in our computers and in our phones that comes from different parts of Africa or that's made in a lab, is different than using the computer itself like we're doing in the education. So there's this kind of network that runs from like the object as it first comes out of the ground all the way up to it going into a recycling or a trash can. And so people have a different relationship with that object, silica, along the path, right? Along the network. Another way of thinking about it is, if you get on the train and you go from, say, the Bronx down to Brooklyn, there's different people at each stop, and they all have a different role, but it's the same train, right? And again, the physical elements that went into creating that train came from some other place, right? So there's all these different humans interacting with the same piece of steel, but they all have different roles and they have different processes in dealing with it. So the knowledge is different based on the relationship with that object. So you can see that's very similar to that idea of like fire, right? And in the novel, the author, or sorry, the main character, talks about fire could be used to heat things, but it could also be used to burn things down. And so you see the object fire can be used in different ways according to your role and how that knowledge is useful to you. So when I bring up these stubborn facts from a law and society perspective, again, which is my field, the theory struggles to gain popularity because it's complex. It doesn't provide a simple answer. One of the simple answers that one of the other theories talk about is the free rider problem, where if one or two people are doing the work, then 8 or 9 people will kind of just sit back and they won't do anything. The problem is that, and if you go over here on the environmental optimism of Elinor Ostrom, is that this doesn't prove itself out to work this way in the real world. It's a clever saying. It seems like it makes sense. Obviously, society would shut down if that were the way it actually worked. But in reality, when you watch groups of people problem solve, each person is kind of adding their own knowledge base to solve the problem. So I think what is going on when people want a simpler answer is they're looking at the motivation and they're saying, well, this person isn't quote unquote trying as hard as the other person. But having played baseball my whole life growing up, some people had what was called an effortless swing. So if you looked at like Ken Griffey Jr., it looked like it was a very effortless swing. And you can look this up on YouTube. Whereas like a Julio Franco looked like he was putting a lot of effort into his swing. But the amount of effort and the motivation, to hit the ball really doesn't have anything to do with the physics of hitting the ball. And so, just because we perceive something, that doesn't mean that's what's really happening from the scientific point of view. And so, obviously, children would prefer probably a simpler story, but as adults, we should start trying to complicate this story. So the second kind of stubborn fact is that much of our educational experience has been based on this unscientific notion that mind and matter are somehow separate. This is, of course, impossible, right? There is no mind without matter. But, coming from the 1600s and the Enlightenment, this was the theory that they were working with at the time. And, it could have been misunderstood. It could have been misapplied. but we do tend to separate, our experience from what we think is objective reality. Whereas what we really should be talking about is our scientific understanding of both of those things as they kind of interact with each other. So if people were more woke, or if they are more aware, more knowledgeable of how knowledge is constructed, would they overcome collective action problems and work together for a common good? And study after study says yes. Woke might not be the word, but I'm just trying to use that example because it's in the popular culture. So the basics that you should memorize for this theory to prepare for the final exam is that the constructivist theory accepts scientific knowledge, especially Einstein's change is constant, right? So your experience is relative, but change is always occurring. And again, you'll see that comes up even in the Parable of the Sower novel. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of examples of social prosperity, or otherwise called utopia. And so, we don't need to think of utopia as impossible. What we need to be trying to understand is what's preventing utopia when we're in the dystopia, when people aren't getting along, when they're not working together. What's going on there? That's what we want to study more. And obviously with the hope that we can change that structure, since change is constant, we just want to try to understand that process better. Now, this theory presumes that most people are agents of change, or that they're capable of change. And that they are changed by structures in their environment, but that they also change structures and environment. So this is kind of a process that's ongoing. Change always occurs, but structured change occurs when a group shares a narrative, they experience a struggle together, and then they cooperate conditionally by making and enforcing constructive rules. So in other words, they start to make rules and norms and laws that work for the furthering of that particular group. It gets complicated, obviously, when there's different groups, and this is this last point. This equation is going to be the most complicated of the equations because it focuses on difference and difference that makes a difference. So if A dominates B and C is watching, what we're really looking at is how do C and B then reconstitute with A? And this has been proved in collective action problems in real social settings and in lab experiments. So one classic example for criminal justice majors is the so-called prisoner's dilemma. When the prisoners have the opportunity to exchange information, not only do they cooperate, again, conditionally, meaning they're persuading each other, but they actually affect the behavior of the police, of the investigator. So that whole structure is then changed by the changing behaviors as communication is shared. So as you'll see, communication, knowledge, and power are always kind of interacting with each other. Now, again, this was the most complicated, so if you want to talk about this further with me, I'd be glad to, but this will also be something you'll be learning in your sociology class.